This is the third video in a series I'm doing on men's friendships. Last week we looked at the 3 requirements of all healthy relationships in the question of whether men and women do friendship differently from each other. And we looked at positivity, consistency, and vulnerability as the things that all friendships, whether male, female, or combined, need to exhibit and need to have. And so today we're going to zero in a little bit deeper on the vulnerability piece, because this is the one of the 3 requirements that is often the lowest for male friendships. I love in the book Deep Secrets by Dr. Niobe Way, the talking about how boys and girls when we're younger do friendship very, very similarly, talk about our friendship similarly. She says here, researchers have also found that boys are as acutely attuned as girls to the emotional complexities in their friendships, have equivalent levels of intimate knowledge about their best friends, are as likely to share each other's emotional state with their friends, and are exceptionally articulate about their emotional lives with their male friends. So when we're watching boys and girls, we see a friendship done almost the same way, as deep and as connected with the talking and all of that combined. It says here in other studies of adolescence that boys are as likely as girls to self-disclose in their friendships, define intimacy in same-sex friendships similarly, and are equally likely to have such friendships at some point during their adolescence. And then unfortunately, when you kind of look at the research and follow it, around the age of 15 or 16, all of a sudden there's kind of a vast difference here. The same boys who talked about their friends a couple years ago with language like, he's my best friend, I can tell him anything, I love him. A couple years later, suddenly that guy is now talking about their friends as like, well, we joke around, we hang out, he's all right. And the languaging and the way we describe friends starts shifting around that age. Here she says that around the age of 15 or 16, we start hearing boys begin to sound like gender stereotypes. And that even though their desire for these relationships remains, and they also start to dismiss the significance of the loss of their friendships as like, well, that's it's all right, we don't need them, it's fine, we're not like the girls. And so what we see happening is somewhere around the age where sexuality becomes a heightened part of a boy's life, there's the great 2 fears that happen with the intimate relationships they have with their friendships. And that is the fear of being considered a homosexual and the fear of being like a girl. And both of those tragically lead to and shape so many boys where they obviously don't want to be like those, like what we would consider. We live in a society where men are, it's a privilege, it comes with a lot of extra privileges, and by not wanting to associate with some of the other types of people that look weaker or are not as accepted, it's really, really tragic. This is the cost that this has on men, is that by trying to disassociate and start living according to these stereotypes, they start losing out on the deep friendships in their lives that girls and homosexuals and other people are allowed to continue to have. It's tragic. And it's actually really interesting because right at the moment in development when the suicide rate among boys in the United States increases to 4 times the rate of girls, this is where we start seeing guys start being more distrustful of having male friends. And I just think that is absolutely tragic. I would imagine all of us do. So what we really want to see here is boys being allowed and being able to be talked about their friendships in a way where we don't genderize this at such a young age and assume. I mean, a lot of what she talks about in the book is how we talk about boys' friendships. We assume, we ask the girls, who's your best friend? And we do a lot more around normalizing friendship for girls than we do for boys. And so as we parent the next generation, let's keep this in mind. And for those of us, for the guys who have been raised where you started perhaps distancing yourself from some of the vulnerability that could deepen those friendships. In the study, when I asked you what helps you feel closest to another guy, remember last week I talked about the 2 number 1 answers by a long shot. One was what topics we talk about, and the other was how safe I feel confiding. And so by twice of any other factor, you men are saying it's the conversation piece, it's the vulnerability piece that helps me feel closest to each other. And in part that's because the positivity of the triangle, the enjoyment, you're like culturally allowed to do that. We encourage guys to go have fun, and we encourage guys to hang out and to do stuff. The consistency piece, where we have failed as a culture, is really encouraging you to share and confide and connect and reveal to each other. And so when we're looking at this subject, I really want to invite you to remember the piece of you that knows you're made for this, that knows that you are capable of this, that knows that you have done this with women. You've hopefully done this with men some, and it may not be as comfortable for many of you if you haven't been in settings where that's been practiced around you and encouraged around you. But it's in you. It is a human need to feel known. That's not a weak thing. It's actually what makes it strong. It's actually the part of us that's like, it's not like eating makes you weak, right? Eating is what makes you strong, and getting enough sleep makes you strong. Being connected makes us strong and healthy. And so we want you to be strong and healthy. If I were just in a couple-minute video to try to give some encouragement around the area of vulnerability and what that might look like, my invitations to men would be to start practicing this. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, he talks about if you put 10,000 hours into anything, you become successful in that thing. And I think about that 10,000 hour rule, and I think about from the age of 15 or 16, if girls were allowed to keep being vulnerable and to keep sharing and keep telling their lives to each other, and boys were starting to be discouraged from that, and you picked that up and cut back on that, then you can see where for women, we may have like gotten our 10,000 hours in, at some point a little sooner than a lot of guys. It's not because we're better at it, but we're probably more practiced at it because we were allowed and encouraged to stay up late into the night talking and to call each other and engage and to connect with that. And so the number one thing I could really invite guys to do is know that it's in you. It's you. You're as good at it as anybody else. And the question is just that it might take a little more practice. It might be something that you have to get more comfortable with, more familiar with, give yourself and others more permission to do. And with practice comes just being really gentle with yourself and each other, right? Like, it doesn't mean it's always going to feel perfect. It's not always going to be comfortable. It's not even for women. That comes as no surprise to anybody. I kind of hate this where we're stereotyping different genders because there's so many guys who do this so much better than women, and this is not a gender thing. And yet, I think in general, a lot of the guys speak to me and write me expressing a desire for more connection and worrying that you're the only one who wants it and that the other guys don't want it. And I think that would be the other invitation to you, is to realize 90% of men, when I asked them if they feel like men have the same relational needs as women, say yes. And when asked what would help them feel closer, it's talking to you, it's confiding in you. And about 73% of you want deeper, closer friendships and want more of that in your life. So assume that most of the men around you are men who would be excited and happy to interact with you and would want that in their own life. And again, they might be uncomfortable and not know how to do it well either, but this is where we just practice. And so my invitation to some of us is to start being the initiators, the ones who start allowing for a few more of those moments, the ones who, even if we're watching a football game, the stereotypical football game, asks a question about, hey, how's life going for you? And how are the kids? How are you feeling about fatherhood these days? And just being able to ask a question here or there, right? And so just practicing doing that and being curious. Practicing sharing something yourself. What's going on in your life that really wants to be witnessed by one of your friends and be seen in their life, and practice offering that. Assume that they would want to know, and that even if your friendship hasn't practiced that thus far, it doesn't mean it doesn't need to or want to, or that you're both not capable of it. I would also say that when you look at the Frientimacy triangle and you've got positivity on the bottom and consistency and vulnerability, that when you're practicing vulnerability, keep the other two sides of the triangle in mind. You're skilled at those other two, very much so. And this is how they can inform your vulnerability. When you're being vulnerable, and remember, vulnerability isn't just talking about hard things and negative things and insecurities, which are important to do, and I encourage you to practice that, but it's also just talking about getting to know each other other, sharing life, talking about the different areas of your life and ideas you're playing with and books you've read. So practice on subjects that feel a little bit safer. And as you practice sharing something that's kind of what I would call lower on the triangle on vulnerability, something that's not really, really high risk, then as they react well to it, and as you practice at that level, you can then increase your level of vulnerability in the future with that person, and you can practice a little bit higher. And so you're never jumping off the deep end without having practiced, like jumping off the 1 foot, the 2 foot, the 3 foot diving board, for example. And your vulnerability should reflect the level of consistency on the other side. So practice this with the guys you've known. Practice this with the guys you've built consistency with. Practice this first and foremost with the guys you have some history with. And the goal here is to get your vulnerability up, matching the level of consistency and history that you've built with those guys. And so do it in a safe way that feels like you're incrementally heightening that, and that you're doing so in relationships where you have the history and the consistency to warrant that, and that this is the area that needs to be brought up to keep it in balance. And then keep in mind with the positivity, the number one thing that has to happen after anybody's vulnerable is to repeat the process and go straight back down to positivity, right? So we start off, it feels good, we want to see them, we hang out with them, that's consistency, we share a little bit and get to know each other, and then it goes down to positivity again, and we just keep cycling through these three things. Meaning that when I share something vulnerable, when he does, when you do, we all want somebody to basically say, yes, I get you. I still love you. The positivity is the validation. It's the encouragement. It's the shared laughter or the empathy, like whatever the right response is to that vulnerability. Just recognize that for all of us, when we feel kind of vulnerable, the very next thing we want to hear is, I still accept you. And while we don't always say it in those words, our reaction, our response to somebody's vulnerability is hopefully an act of positivity that communicates that acceptance, that leaves us feeling good for having shared. So at minimum, when somebody shares something vulnerable with you, the minimum we can do is say, thank you so much for sharing with me. Like, I loved that. That was great. Thanks for calling me and sharing that. You can do it anytime. Like, just to even say thank you and to acknowledge it and to say, I'm glad you called. I'm glad you told me. That's an act of positivity at minimum. Sometimes we can share our own story. Sometimes we can empathize and say, what can I do to be helpful? Sometimes we can just validate and say, oh, I know that feeling. But whatever it is we do, just be mindful that when somebody else is practicing vulnerability, what they need more than anything is us to respond with something that leaves them feeling seen in a safe and satisfying way. And so let's be people who practices offering that, modeling that to our guy friends, and certainly just showing up and being mindful that as we practice the vulnerability, just keep holding that positivity and that consistency piece up, and your vulnerability will be done in a way that feels safe and satisfying. And that's what I want for you. That's what I want for all of us. But guys, you can change the world. You can change your health. You can live longer. You can be happier. It will shift so many things for more men to be practicing vulnerability. There's so many resources out there. There's so many books. Educate yourself, learn, join groups, reach out and practice this with one of your guy friends. But choose to be somebody who's willing to say, okay, this may not be how I've done friendship my whole life, but I want deeper friendships, and I'm willing to do something a little different to try to help make those closer friendships that I know would be good for me. Okay? I hope it's been helpful. I'll do some other videos. Feel free to subscribe. Feel free to ask questions, to share your experiences, to share your tips, your wisdom in the comments. And as always, it's an honor to pop onto your screen for a few minutes.